The Zen Story. Why resistance leads to conflict. The unseen battle of resistance. Have you ever wondered why resistance almost always leads to conflict? Why do movements for positive change, despite their good intentions, so often spiral into division, hostility, or even violence? This question has puzzled philosophers, psychologists, and spiritual seekers for centuries. In today's video, we're going to take a deep dive into this paradox. We'll explore why resistance naturally breeds conflict, how human psychology plays into this dynamic, and what ancient Zen philosophy teaches us about navigating these struggles. If you've ever found yourself caught in a battle, whether ideological, political, or personal, this discussion is for you. Stay with me until the end, because we're going to uncover a profound yet practical approach to overcoming resistance without fueling conflict. Chapter 1. Understanding resistance. More than just opposing forces. The broader perspective. Resistance in the context of Buddhist philosophy. In Buddhism, resistance is often viewed as a manifestation of attachment and aversion, two of the primary causes of suffering, dukkha. The Buddha taught that suffering arises when we cling to desires or resist the flow of life. When we push against reality, we create friction, leading to mental unrest and conflict. A fundamental principle in Buddhist thought is impermanence, anicca. Everything in existence is transient, ever-changing. When we resist change, we are essentially fighting an inevitable truth. This resistance not only drains our energy but also traps us in cycles of suffering. Understanding this principle allows us to embrace the natural flow of life rather than constantly opposing it. The role of mindfulness in overcoming resistance. One of the most effective ways to dissolve resistance is through mindfulness, sati. By observing our reactions non-judgmentally, we can recognize when resistance arises and examine its root causes. 1. Observing without judgment. Instead of reacting to resistance with more resistance, mindfulness teaches us to acknowledge it. When we notice ourselves resisting a situation, a thought, or an emotion, we can take a step back and simply observe. This detachment prevents us from becoming consumed by our impulses. 2. Cultivating acceptance. Resistance is often an unconscious reaction to discomfort. However, when we mindfully acknowledge our discomfort and accept it as part of the present moment, its intensity diminishes. Acceptance does not mean passive resignation but rather the ability to see things as they are without unnecessary struggle. 3. Breathing through resistance. In Buddhist meditation, breath awareness is a powerful tool for managing resistance. When faced with inner conflict, focusing on the breath creates space between reaction and response, allowing clarity to emerge. The breath anchors us in the present, where resistance loses its grip. How resistance fuels suffering. Resistance creates an internal battle that distances us from peace and equanimity. From a Buddhist perspective, suffering is not caused by external circumstances alone but by our reaction to them. The more we resist, the more power we give to the very thing we wish to avoid. Take, for example, the common human tendency to resist negative emotions such as fear, anger, or sadness. When we try to suppress or ignore these emotions, they persist with even greater force. This is known as the second arrow concept in Buddhism. The first arrow is the inevitable pain that arises in life, loss, disappointment, failure. The second arrow is our resistance to that pain, which magnifies our suffering. By letting go of resistance, we allow emotions to flow naturally, neither clinging to them nor pushing them away. This practice of non-resistance is at the heart of equanimity, upekkha, a state of inner balance where external circumstances no longer dictate our well-being. The middle way. Finding balance between resistance and passivity. It is important to note that non-resistance does not mean passivity or indifference. Buddhism advocates the middle way, a path of balance between extremes. While blind resistance creates conflict, passive submission can lead to complacency. True wisdom lies in discerning when to act and when to let go. For example, when facing injustice, resistance born out of anger often escalates the problem. However, mindful action rooted in compassion and understanding can bring about meaningful change. Non-resistance in this context means responding wisely rather than reacting impulsively. Transforming resistance into insight. The key to transcending resistance lies in transforming it into awareness and wisdom. Here are practical steps to achieve this. 1. Self-inquiry. Whenever resistance arises, ask yourself, what am I resisting? Why? Is this resistance serving me or causing more suffering? 2. Reframing challenges. Instead of viewing obstacles as threats, see them as opportunities for growth. Every moment of resistance is a lesson in patience, humility, and impermanence. 3. Practicing loving kindness, metta. Often, our resistance is directed at people, ideologies, or even ourselves. Cultivating loving kindness helps soften this resistance and replaces it with understanding and compassion. 4. Embracing Wu Wei, effortless action, a concept in Taoism that aligns with Buddhist principles. Wu Wei teaches us to flow with the natural rhythm of life rather than forcefully opposing it. This does not mean inaction but rather acting in harmony with the present moment. Chapter 2. Lessons from History. When resistance sparks conflict. We've seen resistance play out in countless historical moments, some leading to positive transformation, others descending into prolonged conflict. But why does resistance often trigger counter-resistance? What fuels this cycle, and is there a path to transcend it? By exploring historical examples through the lens of philosophy, psychology, and Buddhist teachings, we can uncover deeper truths about the nature of conflict and resistance. The Civil Rights Movement, the unyielding force of resistance. The Civil Rights Movement in the United States was a monumental struggle against racial segregation and discrimination. It was not just about changing laws, it was about challenging deeply entrenched societal structures and belief systems. While figures like Martin Luther King Jr. advocated for nonviolent resistance, their efforts were met with brutal opposition from those who feared losing their privilege and power. Resistance to change often stems from attachment, an attachment to identity, to perceived superiority, and to control. From a Buddhist perspective, this attachment leads to suffering, dukkha. When individuals or societies cling to outdated notions of superiority, they create their own suffering through fear, hatred, and division. The cycle of resistance and counter-resistance only perpetuates this suffering. True transformation arises not through violent struggle but through inner awakening and collective compassion. The Arab Spring. Hope and the unintended consequences of resistance. The Arab Spring was fueled by resistance against oppressive regimes, igniting a wave of revolutions across the Middle East. While it symbolized hope for freedom and justice, it also led to instability, civil wars, and new power struggles. Why does resistance sometimes lead to chaos rather than resolution? Buddhist philosophy teaches that impermanence, anicca, is a fundamental truth of existence. Any movement, no matter how noble, must recognize the fluidity of power and the unpredictability of human desires. When resistance lacks a foundation of wisdom and equanimity, it can devolve into destructive cycles of retaliation. True change requires more than the dismantling of oppressive structures. It requires the cultivation of inner and collective harmony. Without mindfulness, even well-intentioned movements can create suffering. The climate change debate. The resistance to truth. Why do some people resist accepting climate science, even in the face of overwhelming evidence? Resistance often arises from fear, fear of change, fear of losing control, and fear of the unknown. Climate change threatens established industries, economic structures, and individual lifestyles, making acceptance difficult for those whose lives are deeply intertwined with the status quo. From a Buddhist standpoint, this resistance is rooted in aversion, dosa, and ignorance, moha. When people resist truth, they often do so because it disrupts their attachment to comfort and security. However, just as clinging to illusions leads to suffering, denying reality only delays the inevitable. The path forward requires not only education but also the cultivation of mindfulness and compassion. Recognizing our interconnectedness with the environment can shift resistance into responsibility. Breaking the cycle. Is there another way? History shows us that resistance breeds counter-resistance, often escalating into deeper conflict. But is resistance itself the problem? Or is it the way we resist? Buddhism offers an alternative. The path of skillful means, upaya. Instead of meeting opposition with force, we can engage in mindful action, resistance rooted in wisdom, compassion, and non-attachment. When resistance is driven by anger and fear, it fuels division. But when it is guided by awareness and a deep understanding of interconnectedness, it becomes a force for true transformation. Nonviolent movements, such as those led by Gandhi and the Dalai Lama, exemplify how resistance can be an expression of inner peace rather than aggression. In the end, the greatest revolution begins within. Only by transforming our own minds, releasing attachments, fears, and aversions, can we hope to change the world without perpetuating cycles of suffering. The lesson from history is clear. Resistance is inevitable, but how we resist determines whether we create peace or conflict. Chapter 3. The Zen Perspective, Flowing with Resistance. Zen philosophy offers a radically different approach. Instead of resisting resistance, it teaches us to move with it, like a river flowing around obstacles rather than smashing against them. This perspective aligns deeply with the Buddhist principle of non-attachment, helping us to navigate conflicts and challenges with grace and wisdom. The story of the empty boat. A Zen master once told his students, "Imagine you are rowing across a lake and another boat crashes into yours. You immediately feel anger rising, until you realize the boat is empty. Instantly, the anger dissolves. Why? Because there is no one to blame. But what if there had been someone in the boat? Would you have shouted, fought back, felt offended? This is the nature of resistance. Our reaction is not to the event itself but to the meaning we attach to it. Zen teaches us to empty our own boats. When we stop identifying so strongly with our beliefs, opinions, and egos, resistance loses its grip, and conflict dissolves naturally. Resistance as an illusion. Resistance is often a creation of the mind. When we resist, we push against reality, attempting to bend it to our will. This only causes suffering. Zen invites us to question the very nature of resistance. Is it real? Or is it just our attachment to a particular outcome? Consider water. It does not resist a rock in its path, it simply flows around it. The harder we push against something, the stronger the counterforce becomes. Zen practice cultivates awareness of this dynamic, allowing us to flow with life instead of struggling against it. Embracing Wu Wei, effortless action. The Taoist concept of Wu Wei, often integrated into Zen teachings, suggests that the best action is often non-action, not in the sense of doing nothing, but in aligning with the natural flow of events rather than forcefully opposing them. Imagine a tree bending in the wind. A rigid tree may break under pressure, but one that sways with the breeze remains rooted. Resistance stiffens us, making us brittle in the face of adversity. By embracing Wu Wei, we move with life's currents rather than exhausting ourselves in opposition. Non-duality. Seeing beyond opposites. One reason resistance creates conflict is that we view life through a dualistic lens, right versus wrong, success versus failure, me versus them. Zen challenges this perspective by inviting us to see beyond duality. In truth, there is no separate self to protect, no enemy to fight against, only interdependent existence. By recognizing our interconnectedness, we loosen our grip on rigid identities and expectations. This shift transforms resistance from a battle into an opportunity for understanding and growth. The practice of letting go. To flow with resistance, we must practice letting go, not as a form of resignation, but as an act of liberation. Letting go means surrendering our need for control, releasing attachments to fixed outcomes, and accepting impermanence. Zen meditation cultivates this mindset, training us to observe our thoughts and emotions without clinging to them. When we realize that everything, including resistance itself, is transient, we develop an inner stillness that cannot be disturbed by external circumstances. Living in the present moment. Resistance often arises from clinging to the past or fearing the future. Zen teaches us to anchor ourselves in the present moment, where conflict has no foothold. Through mindfulness, we learn to meet challenges with curiosity instead of defensiveness, with openness instead of resistance. This presence transforms even difficult situations into opportunities for insight and self-discovery. Chapter 4. Practical Strategies. Transforming Resistance into Understanding. 1. Practice non-attachment. Non-attachment is not indifference. It is the ability to see things as they are without being overly influenced by personal biases or emotions. In Buddhist philosophy, attachment is one of the fundamental causes of suffering, dukkha. When we cling to our beliefs as absolute, we create a mental rigidity that prevents growth and understanding. Instead, approach ideas with a sense of openness and fluidity. Ask yourself, is this belief serving me, or am I serving it? When we recognize that beliefs are conditioned by our upbringing, experiences, and environment, we become more willing to engage with alternative perspectives without feeling threatened. A practical way to cultivate non-attachment is through mindfulness meditation. By observing your thoughts without identifying with them, you train yourself to hold beliefs with awareness rather than possession. This practice leads to greater emotional resilience and flexibility in conversations and conflicts. 2. Pause before reacting. The space between stimulus and response is where transformation occurs. Resistance often arises as an automatic reaction to perceived threats, whether to our identity, our control, or our ego. Before responding impulsively, take a breath and ask, what is at the root of my reaction? Is it fear of being wrong? A need to be in control? The desire to be validated? A useful practice is the 3-breath rule. Before responding, take 3 slow, deep breaths. This simple act activates the parasympathetic nervous system, calming your body and mind, allowing for a more measured and compassionate response. Another technique is labeling emotions in the moment. Instead of saying, I am angry, say, there is anger in me right now. This slight linguistic shift creates psychological distance from the emotion, reducing its hold over your actions. 3. Listen deeply. Deep listening is an art and a practice. In Buddhist teachings, listening with full presence is considered an act of compassion. True listening goes beyond hearing words. It seeks to understand the emotions, fears, and needs behind them. To practice deep listening, maintain soft eye contact and open body language. Reflect on what is being said before formulating a response. Ask clarifying questions. Can you tell me more about why this matters to you? Summarize what you understand. It sounds like you're feeling frustrated because. By listening without the intent to refute or persuade, we create an environment where resistance naturally dissolves, making space for authentic dialogue. 4. Reframe conflict as a lesson. Buddhism teaches that suffering and challenges are opportunities for awakening. When faced with resistance, ask yourself, what is this teaching me? Is it highlighting an attachment I have to being right? Is it exposing a fear I have of losing control? Is it showing me an area where I need more patience and compassion? One powerful way to reframe conflict is through the beginner's mind approach. Instead of seeing yourself as an expert with all the answers, approach conflicts as a student willing to learn. When you view resistance as a mirror reflecting your inner landscape, you turn external conflicts into valuable internal growth experiences. 5. Move with, not against. Resistance, like water encountering an obstacle, can either crash against it or find a way around it. When we meet resistance with force, through anger, defensiveness, or insistence, it only strengthens. However, when we meet it with curiosity and openness, we create an opportunity for connection. Instead of pushing back against someone's resistance, try mirroring and validation. I see that this is really important to you. It makes sense that you feel that way given your experiences. I appreciate you sharing your perspective. This approach does not mean agreement but rather acknowledgement. When people feel heard, they become more open to hearing others. Another useful metaphor is Aikido communication, a practice inspired by the martial art of Aikido, where instead of resisting an opponent's force, you blend with it to redirect energy. In conversation, this means acknowledging resistance and gently guiding it toward understanding rather than confrontation. Chapter 5. Conclusion: The Path to Peace. The next time you find yourself resisting, whether it's a conversation, a political idea, or a personal struggle, pause and ask yourself, am I fueling conflict by resisting? Or can I take a step back and flow with the situation? Resistance is natural, but conflict is not inevitable. By understanding the deeper forces at play, by learning from Zen philosophy, and by practicing mindfulness in our interactions, we can transform resistance into an opportunity for growth, connection, and true change. Now, I'd love to hear from you. What has been your experience with resistance and conflict? Have you ever found yourself caught in an endless cycle of opposition? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you're interested in learning more about conflict resolution, mindfulness, and Zen philosophy, be sure to subscribe and stay tuned for our next discussion.